I'm going to just put us live. I'm not fully recording it. I'm going to hit the record button on my side. I recorded for two different programs.
Okay. Yeah, I'll record too. Anything I should specifically be aware of?
No, in general, I'm not going to do the. Sometimes I'd like record the intro with the person on the other line. I'm just going to record the intro probably Monday or later on.
Okay.
And so what will happen is like I'll have an intro. There'll be Ask Historians music.
Mhm.
And Kim, so I'm gonna like have a moment of silence and be like, "Welcome to the Ask Historian podcast, Commie Space Invader."
Thank you.
Okay, let me just pull up Ask Historians, Reddit.
Let's see how this works on my end, but I think that should work. And I'm recording live.
Great. Sounds good. Sounds like we'll have audio on both sides. Commie Space Invader. So I don't butcher it. Is it Wehrmacht war crimes in your flare?
Yeah, Wehrmacht.
Okay.
It's
Wehrmacht.
yeah.
Okay. I don't want to horribly butcher it. My German is elementary. I know about enough to order beer and go to the bathroom.
Don't worry about it. It's all good.
I think I can maybe swear. Maybe. I can sing the children's song, Head, Shoulders, Knees, and Toes.
Very good. Very nice.
All right. Hit record on my end. And here we go. It's going to be a brief moment of silence, and we will go. Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. Today we are joined by Commie Space Invader. Flared on the subreddit is moderator, Holocaust, Nazi Germany, and Wehrmacht war crimes, who will be discussing to us what exactly fascism is and how it is constructed and runs through everything. So first things first, welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Thank you so much. It's good to be back.
It's always good to have you. So first things first, what actually got you interested in this topic?
Well, I think I explained last time that I was on the podcast that as a scholar of National Socialism and of Nazism, that I got interested in this subject via various activities I did, including left-wing groups in my youth, as well as family connections in that some of my relatives were persecuted and victimized by Nazism. And the study of fascism relates strongly to the study of Nazism, especially vis-a-vis the idea of putting Nazism into a international context or contextualizing it with other regimes of the era. And I do find that fascism is highly politically relevant these days. I mean, I think that we have all seen that on the sub with an increase in questions on the subject and also in political discourse with an increase of a lot of think pieces published in the media and so on and so forth. So studying fascism today is probably very, very relevant, I would contend.
Do you think you are interested in more in how it comes as an ideology that makes the Nazis or other people do what they do, or is it the other way around, that you think that the Nazis created fascism as a way to justify what they were doing?
I think that, I mean, I take it with George L. Mosse, who is a noted scholar of fascism, that in order to really grasp the period of fascism and the crimes of fascism, from the Italians to the Germans to other fascist regimes, we need to understand what drove people into the arms of these political movements and how the people who supported it perceived these movements. So I think it's the question that what made these ideas that encompass the political ideology of fascism so interesting to people, and what made them support it, because that's where the real question lies. I mean, you can have these regimes that have an authoritarian bent to them, but in many cases they need to get into power first, and then they need to build a power base where they can only do what they do with a certain amount of support among the population.
So if I can use an analogy in a sense, what I think is what you're saying is fascism is like a disease that can arise when other things aren't there. Like in the case of AIDS, you have HIV come because like you don't have that immune system to protect yourself from it.
I do find the disease metaphor a little bit difficult, because it's this very image of the people or the state as a body that needs to be protected from disease is an essential fascist imagery. So I do find it very difficult to talk about it in terms of like a disease that we as historians can inoculate against. I would rather say that fascism as a bona fide ideology of the 20th century, because unlike liberalism, and I mean like classical European liberalism, unlike communism, and unlike conservatism, again conservatism in the classical European sense, fascism arises not in the 19th century and has its canon expanded on there, but rather fascism arises after World War One, which are specific historical conditions. But in these specific historical conditions, certain views and ideas and practices are developed that are as relevant for society today as they were back then. And I think that in general, unlike a disease that arises when there is no immune system left, the problem of fascism is really inherent in modernity itself, and therefore, like the idea of an inoculation or something is not
A useful
really
one.
a correct metaphor or useful metaphor, because it requires a constant vigilance and reaffirmation of um, democratic and enlightenment norms to guard against fascism.
Mm-hmm. So let's start with some definitions then. Like fascism, of course, is curled around as an insult online, and you see it in public and increasingly on TV. But what exactly would you say fascism is?
Well, this is where the difficulty starts, because I mean, fascism works in many ways as a term. Like, you can use it as a strictly historical term describing a regime in Italy that called itself fascist. It is definitely a term that appears often in political propaganda, and then you have its meaning as a basically um, term or an analytical category that we as historians can use to talk about certain historic and contemporary political movements and ideas. And I feel like in recent times, with soaring sales of Hannah Arendt's book on totalitarianism and all the listicles that appear online, like these are the 10 warning signs for fascism, and the appearance or reappearance of Umberto Eco's essay on Urfascism, I think there is this particular thirst for information, specifically in the category of fascism as an analytical category, because people like want to know, like, are we threatened by fascism? Is a resurgence of fascism likely? And so I want to do this podcast to bring a certain light into this question of fascism as a political category, because when I read these listicles, I think they obfuscate more than they enlighten. Like, you have the warning sign of fascism is extreme nationalism, and I'm like, okay, that sounds fine, but what is extreme nationalism, and how does it differ from normal nationalism in quotes, or other nationalism? How can we define that? So that I think is the first problem. And the second problem is that a lot of what underpins these debates is this very widespread image of fascism people have, and that is like this very Leni Riefenstahl-esque picture of people marching in swastika formation, burning books, wearing uniforms, and jackbooted and leather-clad thugs coming to your home and beating down your door. And also that also can be difficult to reconcile with fascism as a political category, because it's so overshadowed by its pop cultural image that I really want to go into fascism as a form of political behavior, or a form of set of practices, which I will expand on in this podcast, I think.
Yeah, so our normal images of fascism, of course, are, I guess, would be those people marching in swastika formation, Nazi Germany, the speeches, and to a lesser extent, at least in the American history, American classrooms, I guess, would be Italy. But are there other fascist states that you would point to as examples of it?
Well, I think that when I expand on how I define, or how I would define fascism, I think there is a lot of historical examples one can point to, from the Italians to the to the to the Germans, to various regimes in World War II, along the lines of the Ustascha or even the Austro-fascists. And there is a case to be made that even regimes like Franco's regime in Spain, or the Estado Novo in Portugal, can be classified, at least at certain times, as fascist. But the trouble always is with this category, that it's rather hard to pin down, and the debate of what fascism is probably as old as fascism itself. I mean, you mentioned it arose in Italy. It arose in a specific context after World War I, where it was founded as a really bona fide 20th century ideology, strongly influenced by the happenings of post-World War I Europe, of a continuation of violence of the war, and of a certain fear of communist takeover and violence breaking out. And so, I mean, if we look at the historical examples of how people try to define fascism, the first example of the attempt at such a definition would, of course, be those the fascists reacted violently against, namely the communists. And if you don't mind, I would like to go into a little bit how, in different contexts, people have tried to define fascism, if that's all right with you at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, as I said, it starts in some ways with the communists, who developed early theories of fascism, specifically in Germany, but also in Italy. Gramsci writes about it, but also Trotsky and others, and these first attempts really try to contextualize it within communist theory. And one of the lasting legacies of that is Bonapartism, which comes from a text by Marx about Louis Bonaparte in France, and it's this idea that there is a strong man that appears and takes power to restore balance between the classes and uphold the system, and has this very populist streak that tries to appease both sides of the class conflict. And this is very much inspired in a certain way by the first conflicts between communists and fascists in Italy, in the Po Valley, where basically you have fascist goon squads offering themselves up to large landholders to beat up their striking workers. So, so this is very much influenced by this. And later on, the Marxist theory of fascism was expanded on by people like Dimitrov, who see fascism as the attempt by the most reactionary elements of capitalism to rise to power and to shore up the system against impending revolution. And while these ideas are certainly interesting, and the economic underpinning that, as typical in Marxist theory, informs these ideas of fascism, they're also, in my opinion, have the problem that it's a rather reductionist, in certain ways, interpretation of fascism that has a hard time accounting for certain, well, first of all, cultural influences of fascism, as well as for the pragmatic nature of many fascist regimes. I mean, if you take Italy, the longest lasting fascist regime, it undergoes a historic transformation where the regime changes in various aspects from one time or another. Like the fascist regime of 1922 is not the same as the fascist regime of 1938. And I feel like this wholly historic materialist interpretation of fascism fails to account for these changes, really. But they're not the only ones. Like the Marxists are not the only ones that try to get a grasp on this ideology and this phenomenon. Like especially after World War II, a very popular theory to grasp what fascism is, or at least what some manifestations of fascism were, is totalitarianism. Which is this idea developed in the West that there is a unifying streak between Stalinist rule in Russia and Nazist and fascist rule in Germany specifically, and that these ideas are wholly new and unique in that they seek total control over every aspect of the population they have under their regime. With this theory that sees a sort of revival in rising sales with Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, I feel like this whole totalitarianism idea is sort of like a pineapple pizza. You know, you look at it first and it sort of looks good, but when you think about it closer, it makes little sense.
I think a few people might be offended at your characterization, pineapple pizza. Where would you say like the current theory is? I'm grasping at least is that people who study fascism are much like people who study feudalism. They're unhappy with a lot of the older models and theories of fascism. What do you think current historiography has really turned to?
Absolutely. I also think they're happy, and they're also happy with totalitarianism, because totalitarianism is this very top-down look that sees the masses just as, you know,
Pyramid.
Yeah, and seduced by the regime, or completely controlled by the regime, by terror, and that I think does not accurately reflect really the state of scholarship. I mean, I think one of us, 10 Minute History, recently wrote a piece about different schools of interpretation of Soviet history, and made this very apt point that you know, the totalitarianist theory oversees popular participation in the regime on a very fundamental level, and I think that is a very good point. So when we talk about what current historiographies, how current historiography sees fascism, there is a lot of things to unpack, and I think one of the first things I need to highlight in that context is that it isn't possible to take over the model that fascists proposed of what fascism is one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have theoretics of or theorists of fascism, like Giovanni Gentile, Julius Evola, who became recently notorious because he's cited by people in important public positions, but also like the Germans, Carl Schmitt or Martin Heidegger, although one has to say that the Italians were much more productive and probably more highly regarded within their own context than Schmitt or Heidegger, who quickly disappeared again. But the problem with them is that they are so mired in purposefully obtuse language, esoteric concepts, and political concepts that are so foreign to us today that you can't really just take them and transfer them one-on-one to encompass the political system of fascism as a category of analysis. Like, for example, Evola, or Gentile talks a lot about the organic state and how the state develops organically, which are not categories we frequently use anymore because they are so meaningless in certain ways. And Evola is even worse. Like he talks a lot about the Holy Grail, the metaphysics of war, how modernity is defeated by alchemy, and this is my favorite part, dark, violent, sexual powers to be used against the modern world in form of tantric practices. Which is really weird when you think about it. Like, here's this fascist theoretician, and what he tells you is, have kinky sex and the modern world will fall.
I see. You can just see the problems with that now. I'm thinking similar in my own field. People look at the body as like a machine almost. So like they'll say like, well, prostitution is just a safety valve for the overpowering sexual urges of men. So we need prostitution in order to get rid of that.
Something along these lines, although with Evola it's much more obscure. Like he would never argue that there is a safety valve involved for social problems. He would argue that, I don't know, sex sets free your dark mystic powers, which you can harness to build a warrior cult to defeat modernity in all its rationalized glory, because rationality is completely wrong on the fundamental level, and rather we need to experience, the spirit of fascism through sex. So you see what I mean? That it's kind of hard to translate that into a category of analysis.
Yeah, it is. So there are different flavors of fascism almost. I as much as I hated like a Nazi German fascism flavor and the Franco Spanish fascism flavor.
There are, like, in the historic manifestations, there are things that result in different policies and different rhetoric because of the different historical contexts in which these movements arrive. But I think that it's fair to say that there is a overarching similarity that underlies all these different regimes that are usually counted as fascist in history. And what I found most useful to understand these similarities as a category of analysis really is Robert Paxton's idea that he develops in The Anatomy of Fascism, that basically that fascism is a form of political behavior. And if I may quote him, he writes, "Fascism is a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion.
Mm-hmm. So that, I think that's a very useful quote, because it seems like it can be applied both like to specific historical societies, but can be applied to the whole fascism as a whole. And so how does it create and enforce these systems?
Well, few of the points that Paxton makes that are, that inform this definition is that fascism as a set of practices and as a political behavior is based on a specific understanding of history. And this specific understanding of history is one that is very social Darwinist in nature. And before the people listening to this go and take to the comment section and point out that social Darwinism has nothing to do with Charles Darwin and his ideas, well, yes, I'm aware of that. Thank you. And I also think that there is a connection in terms of Darwin's legacy, but that is probably best for another time.
Mm-hmm.
However, the main point is that fascists see the engine of history, that what drives history, is conflict. And it's conflict between nations, peoples, races, whatever you want to call them, but between these central collective actors that are sort of like these mythical communities based on nation, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. And they always must be in conflict because that is the natural state of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that what drives history forward. You can see this manifested in German ideas of anti-Semitism in the 19th century, where you have this idea that, the nationalist German Aryan people are in conflict with the international Jews and the Catholic Church, who is also international, and the communists, who are also international. And this is the great conflict that history has always been fought over. And it's not just that this conflict drives history, but it's also that they specifically in their community, their nation, their people, their race are victims in this conflict. It's one's own people are victimized by the enemy, who is practically everyone else. And that creates this sort of sense of impending doom.
Mm-hmm.
Their version of history, unlike Marxist history, which drives forward towards a positive end goal, or weak history, which also goes forward to a positive end goal, their version of history, the fascist version of history, is one that always plays with this sense of impending apocalypse that is near, and the constant threat that threatens one's own people from like the internal enemy, the external enemy, being outbred, being overrun by foreigners, being subverted, being destroyed. This is the atmosphere they create, and at the same time they propose that this impending doom can only be averted with radical action, which is usually translated into violence. Because they assert that the democratic states or other forms of political organizations are too weak to prevent the apocalypse from coming and their people, their nation, their race being destroyed in the internal conflict between everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so they choose this radical action, this violence, to employ in order to reach their utopia, which is peculiar because unlike a liberal, again, in the classical sense, or a communist utopia, it's not an utopia that is based on, how great society will be in the future, but their utopia is based on the reestablishment of a past romanticized and mythological golden age that consists of their people, their race, their nation exerting dominance over others, and that dominance must be reestablished in order to reestablish this past golden age. Like in the Italian fascist case, it's the Roman Empire they feel they need to reestablish. With the Germans, it's Lebensraum, living space in the East that needs to be reconquered from the Slavic hordes in order to bring about the new German golden age. Or even with the smaller regimes like the Austro-fascists embraced this version of society that is heavily influenced by a Catholic sort of feudalism where everyone knows their place and is sorted in societal ranks according to what job they have, and in accordance with that afforded political participation and others. So it's really important to understand that for fascism, history is conflict, social Darwin is conflict. In this conflict, they are victimized and there's a sense of impending doom. And this necessitates radical action in form of violence to bring about the past golden age again.
I think, yeah, so that's a perfect summary. It's fascism is a past looking sort of, I guess, philosophy, and that's why it's so important for it to control and use history, because history is the engine, or I guess that powers the whole system. Because when you're looking past to a golden age, you're not saying like we can change these laws and we work slowly toward a golden utopia in the future. Instead, you're saying like, no, we need to turn back the clock and go back to that golden age, and we need to like get rid of everything in our way.
Exactly. And at the same time, you're defending yourself against the onslaught of the enemy in the form of modernity. And in order to return to this golden age, it's, for example, imperative that a past level of assumed purity is reached again. Like you see manifestations of this in the euthanasia programs in Nazi Germany. That this whole idea of, you know, you need to purify the nation, and things like mental illness are manifestations of corrupt modernity, and we need to bring about purity with violence against the internal enemy, in this case, the handicapped and mentally ill.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the times you see people target Nazi Germany in a way to say like, oh, well, none of their ideas were original. Like they took the euthanasia program from the United States, so that makes the United States complicit. They took the idea of concentration camps from British concentration camps in Africa. And I think of what you're saying in those cases, those systems, as evil they were, had a different end goal than what the Nazi Germany regime put them to.
Well, well, the difficulty in these questions is that, you know, how do you really establish that link directly? First of all, second of all, I think that specifically to the euthanasia program, like this must be understood as something that was very much in fashion at the time, like that fitted the general timeline, because this whole idea of purification of one's own population is a central idea of fascism, but it's not like it's not exclusive to them. Other states had similar ideas about their own purity and reasserting that purity. But I think it's imperative to always note in this discussion, like, while the euthanasia program in the United States and the euthanasia program in Germany were influenced by similar ideas and similar, how do you say, fashionable ideologies at the time, there is a distinct difference in that, you know, even though the United States did horrible things to people in the course of these programs, it does not compare on scale to a mass killing program akin to Nazi Germany. And the difference why that is can be explained from fascist ideology, because while the United States might also have been obsessed with this idea of genetical purity, they did not exactly use it as a tool to return to a past golden age of purity where the population needed to be purified in order to fight the internal and external enemy. So I think the different dynamics of these programs result from that, because for all the horror of the United States euthanasia program, there is still a difference between the scale and just the sheer thinking behind it, in the sense that, you know, it's horrible to go and sterilize people on court orders, but it's not the same as confining them by the thousands to gas chambers and just killing them.
So fascism, ultimately, the defining feature of it is dominance over culture, dominance over others, and especially dominance from within, because you're trying to prevent that enemy. I mean, that enemy might be working with forces within or without the system. So you have this overwhelming fear, and you have to like dominate every other system in order to get away from this the brink of the abyss, in a sense.
I would definitely agree that at the core of fascism, there is the idea of dominance over others in order to assert one's rightful place in the world as they see it, and to avert the impending catastrophe brought about by the enemy, who is everyone else. And this is why I think this is important to understand in their thinking, because fascists very often, and this encapsulates another problem with fascist theorists, in this, that for fascist theorists, as another contributor to the sub put it, there is nothing meaningful to say outside of fascism, and fascism itself does not perceive itself as an ideology per se. I like the German word of Weltanschauung, which literally translates to worldview, but in the original has a couple of other implications that are that, you know, you're not like an ideology interested in the truth of the proposition you put forward and the debate of that truth, but rather you're interested in action, in the deed. This cult of the deed is something that encapsulates fascism, in the sense that you don't care about debating your own political standpoint with other people, and you don't care necessarily about the truthfulness of what you say, because everything you do, and the only truth that matters, is to fulfill this destiny of your people to dominate over others. And the truth is whatever permitted the right people to dominate, whatever made them triumph, which is why fascist regimes are also so immensely flexible and adaptable in their politics. Like, you can go through several phases where it's no problem for either the Nazis or the Italian fascists to perfectly collaborate with traditional social elites, the abolishment of whom they demanded in their earlier political program. Like, you can, like the Nazis, say, well, we want to get rid of, you know, the bloodsuckers of financial capital, and then perfectly well cooperate with them when it suits your needs. Like,
Mhm.
it truth and consistency only matter as much as it informs the end goal, or it don't matter as much when it comes to the end goal, and therefore what's more important is the actual deed and the doing of fascism. And I think that's why I like Weltanschauung or worldview literally translated so much, because Weltanschauung already encompasses an activity like looking at the world and not pondering it actively or thinking about it or having an idea about it like the word ideology implies, but
Mhm.
rather it's the activity of looking, the deed of looking. And that translates very well into general fascist thinking of themselves, that they are more interested in actually doing fascism than in debating fascism or developing fascism as an idea.
That's terrifying how both subversive and pervasive it is, and how it can mm, take those different forms to accomplish the goals. Like you said, the doing of it is more important than necessarily like purity of it.
It is. It is. I mean, that's why it lends itself so perfectly well to extra legal or pseudo legal action within its system. Like, the whole idea of putting people into a concentration camp did experience some legalist backlash in Germany, but was very quickly crushed, and the whole legal system basically went along with it after some point, not because necessarily of the brutal repression of the legal system the Nazis put in place, but just because the pervasiveness of this idea of, we're not tied down by these rules, but we must do what is right in action, or how it was so easy to quickly encourage both in Italy and in Nazi Germany the state apparatus in form of the police to employ massive violence against political opponents and detractors.
Hmm.
And this whole idea of doing fascism underlies that, not being interested in abstract ideas and debates, but rather in concrete action that needs to be asserted.
And it's because the systems, the checks and balances, or the laws aren't, they may be there, but they're not as strong. They're not, everybody's lost faith in them, or they're refusing to enforce them. So like they just break down because there's no belief in them anymore, and fascism can hijack them and sweep them away.
To a certain extent, yes. I mean, a democratic system only functions so long everybody goes along with it. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, if you order the police to do something and they refuse to do it, how are you gonna make them?
Right.
Or if Hitler, as the chancellor and president, orders his executive branch to do something and they do it, how are you as the judiciary gonna stop it? Like, what are you gonna do in terms of concrete actions? You can only it only the system works as long as everybody keeps to the rules. And if the fascists come along and subvert this by constantly and with a certain amount of popular support, subvert all this, because they can always argue the people are on our side and support this decisive action, and we experience this massive support by the mythical community of the nation, the people, the race, and therefore we are legitimate in not keeping with these rules that previously made us as a nation weak and allowed our enemies to subvert it. And for this argument of mass popular support, which is always in their case is always overblown. Like, there was significant mass support for fascism in both Italy and Nazi Germany, as well as other fascist regimes. But it's never as big, like there's never as many convinced fascists as the regime likes to say there are. And there is never, like, this mythical community is never achieved. But the key to this sort of political behavior lies in the transfer, in what Walter Benjamin calls the transformation of politics into aesthetics. Again, with the cult of the deed and with the, you know, non-concern with truth of statements, there is a specific thinking behind this, namely that politics is not a way forward to decide the best course after having weighed all the arguments. But for the fascists, politics is an aesthetics experience, a creation of a mythical union of the leader, its people, and history. You know, when we think about fascism and we see these Leni Riefenstahl images of screaming Germans in stadiums saying in Sieg Heil in unison, and experiencing this totality of excitement when hearing Hitler. This is what Benjamin means. It's this transformation of politics from a necessary way to decide the course of a country into an experience of being part of something greater, of being part of the masses, of being part of this mythical union, of achieving the greater goal in history. There is almost, like, Benjamin describes it almost as a lustful experience of experiencing yourself as the cog in the machine of history. And when we see the people reacting with absolute ecstasy to hearing Hitler, it's not necessarily what they hear that causes this ecstasy, but the whole experience of hearing it, like being in the stadium, being in the crowd, marching in form of a swastika, and so on and so forth. It's this aesthetic, this experience of politics as aesthetics that really encompasses one of the essential features of fascism.
The quote I think of is that politics is a substitution for violence, but I guess the spin here would be fascism is that violence taken into action.
Exactly, because as Benjamin asserts, like, the ultimate aesthetic of fascism is war, because it treats, because it relies on this conflict that for them underpins all of history, and therefore all of politics. And so the ultimate aesthetic manifestation where the people feel part of the mythical union of the Volksgemeinschaft or the Raza, or whatever you want to call it, the Aryan race, is when they experience the ultimate pleasure of being the soldier cog in the huge machine and dying for your country. That is the ultimate expression. Dying for your country and killing others is the ultimate expression of fascist political aesthetic. And this cult of the deed, the aesthetic transformation of politics, and the obsession with both the internal and external enemy in fascism is what really drives fascist violence against political opponents, against imagined racial opponents, and in terms of their drive for external expansion. So it's all these elements coming together that form the basis for the radicalization, first of the political movement, which often expresses itself in violence, and then the political rule, which often results in violence against internal enemies and against or perceived internal enemies and against external enemies.
So let's try to bring all those things together to bring us to some sort of conclusion. How do all of these themes and ideas and portrayals of fascism as a whole come together? How do they work to drive that history, to drive that engine?
Well, it pardon. Pardon. These elements that I described come together in various ways. Like, they are immensely helpful in establishing the fascist movement within a political context. Like, many people will say that fascism arrives in times of certain crises, and that's not entirely false, in the sense that oftentimes a crisis of financial, political, or otherwise can help establish these movements and their rhetoric of impending doom and responsibility of the enemy within a political context. Like, we see the Nazis being extremely successful with this tactic, especially once the crisis of 1929 hits, in that they really can tap into certain fears and a certain feeling of things are not going well. And that there this comes into play, and it makes it easy to adopt this view of how do you say, adopt this view of history as conflict. So that is immensely helpful. Like, these elements can be immensely helpful for them to establish themselves in a political discourse, because they also can take on the mantle of, the people who will finally act, not weighed down by convention or rules, but who will finally help us take our faith into our own hands and establish finally our place in the world that we deserve. So I think this is the first instance where this all comes together, and the second important instance where this all comes together is when in power, all these elements, especially the one about, the feeling of being under constant threat, this is what really enables the usual radicalization of these regimes. Robert Paxton, for example, writes, the fascist regime, it radicalizes or it ends in entropy and dies a slow death.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Nazi German case, it's all these elements that enable them within the specific German context of the time to gradually accept that they must kill the Jews in their mind. Like that this radicalization, which happens over a longer span of time and finally ends in what we now today call the Holocaust, is in part driven by this very thinking of being under threat, history is conflict, impending doom, and we need to act about this, the call of the deed. While in the Italian case, I'm sure some of our experts on the sub would be happy to point out more on that. You have a more up and down, but there are definite phases where the Italian regime radicalizes out of the same thinking and same elements that inform the German case. And other regimes do that too. Like, you have a definite pattern of radicalization with the Ustaša in Croatia, with sort of like with the Austro-fascists too, and also with the Iron Legion and other instances where this went down historically. So I think that are the two most important points where this all converges to form the specific mixture of or that enables fascism.
Mm-hmm. So let's When you sent me the notes, you sent me this really fascinating, I guess, the life, the lifestyle, the life path of fascism. What is the, as a way of bringing us to an absolute clue, what is the life cycle of a fascist movement from start to finish?
Well, the fascist movement is usually created as a very radical movement. Like in both the German and the Italian cases, which are the major cases, which is why I'm always bringing them up, they're founded as radical movements that seek to overthrow the established order that, in their opinion, has committed crimes that are so wrong that they need to be rectified in this context, or in their context, the end of World War One and the consequences of that end, from communist revolution in Russia to the Treaty of Versailles or Italy, feeling like a losing power despite being on the winning side.
Mm-hmm.
And from there on, they established themselves as a very disruptive force within the political system that often starts out as working with small scale violence or small scale disruptive elements, and gradually become, in a certain sense, less radical in their immediate want to overthrow the whole system, but rather become at first very adaptable in working together with traditional established elites, especially when it comes to seizing power. Like both in the Italian case as well as in the Nazi German case, there is this moment of when the fascists start to collaborate with traditional social elites from the military, from the bourgeoisie, from the political class, in order to gain power, mainly by evoking the fear of communism, while at the same time working very hard to bring the complete political system to a standstill, like, and then use that standstill once again to emphasize why it's only them who can save the nation from impeding threats from inside and outside. And once in power, they rule with what can best be described as a dynamic shapelessness, like pushing back against the established democratic or liberal order where they feel necessary, mostly in terms of like police and judiciary, and establishing their own spaces within society, like merging the police and the SS, which originally was a party formation. So there you have this sort of dynamicness that underpins their whole actions, but at the same time they can leave other norms pretty much untouched. Like, I don't know, in the beginning the Nazis would not reform civil law in order to conform to their standards, except at very specific points. So you can have this like sort of coexistence of the old system where it's useful and the new radicalized system of the fascists.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, within this power dynamic, there then develops this whole idea of the radicalization. Like, because of their specific worldview, of their specific veneration of action, they must either radicalize or fizzle out to a certain extent, or devolve into a normal authoritarian state from a specifically fascist authoritarian state. So they need this radicalization to move forward, which is also why it's very fitting that most of them will say, we're not a party, we're not an ideology, we're a Weltanschauung or a movement, because it's literally the movement they need, because they constantly need to evolve and radicalize in their politics in order to stay in place. And then comes the end, either through entropy, in terms of people are being fed up and getting rid of the system, the political class intervening and getting rid of the system, or, as was the case in many a fascist regime under Nazi tutelage and the Nazis themselves, because of war.
I guess that's the happiest note we could probably end it on, isn't it? But I just want to say thank you. I think this has been a really great episode, and I'm really excited to bring this to everybody. And I'm sure, like with any question or topic that's complicated, I couldn't have covered every possible angle from it. But that is why we will have a follow-up thread and Ask Historians, where people can come and ask their questions. So please come, if you're listening and you have some more questions about fascism or for Commie Space Invader, please come and join us in the thread.
Yes, thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer all your questions.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we're good. Cut. Nice job.
Good. So, happy?
Yeah, I'm very happy. This is absolutely fascinating. I learned a lot more than I thought. As I was following along, I had to resist the impulse to be like, oh my God, modern America! Oh my God,
it's
so hard.
That was part of the idea behind it, and I wrote the episode, or did the episode in my head with this whole idea of alluding to modern America without explicitly saying it.
Yeah.
When it comes to like the experience of I don't know, the mythical union with the leader and chanting the slogans and so on. It's all very Trump-esque, let's put it that way.
So when you were talking about the whole life cycle, I was like, okay, so we did the radical movement, we did the rooting in the political system, but Trump is really just failing at collaborating with the traditional elite.
Yeah, so that was a bit the idea, that it was going to sort of like talk about it without talking about it.
Yeah, it's like we were kind of dancing around the topic, and I think people will appreciate that, and hopefully we won't have to remove too many questions about Donald Trump.
Well, I mean, he's never explicitly mentioned, but people can draw their own conclusions, I think, from what I said. Sometimes it wasn't. I was thinking about, maybe at some point saying, well, and they said we're gonna make Italy great again, but I thought that would be too much on the nose, probably.
Make Italy great again.
So I'm currently exporting the audio file I recorded. Which format would
MP3.
You like it in? MP3. Okay.
Yep, absolutely.
MP3.
The Hangouts come down. I can just download it as an audio file over MP4. Some of the new technology coming down. I just listened to a podcast on this on Radiolab, and it's like the people who made Photoshop. What they can do now, they developed this new software which is like audio Photoshop. And all you have to do is record yourself talking for 20 minutes, or I think 40 minutes, and then you can literally type out what you want your own voice to say.
Whoa!
You can just type it out, and it will like say exactly in your voice and your accent and your inflections, everything. It's really, really creepy. I'll send you a link to the podcast. But additionally, they developed a Photoshop for video, in which you could have one person controlling like Barack Obama's face in Barack Obama's voice, saying exactly. It's really fucking trippy. It's really scary.
That is super duper creepy, man.
Yeah,
it's like really, whoa.
We want his reality anymore, right? I don't even know what we do, and is democracy strong enough to grapple with those sort of things?
So I'm seeing that my program seems to have some difficulty with its MP3 encoder. Can I also send it to you just as a I don't
Yeah,
know, like,
whenever you can export it as, I can convert it over to MP3.
well, I have AIFF, WAV,
Wave, yeah, that's fine.
Wave is fine. Okay, then it's gonna be a Wave. And I put it in the Dropbox. Like,
Yep.
which email address would you like me to share it with?
Vertexoflife@gmail.
Vertex of Life at Gmail.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. So I'll just quickly throw it into the Dropbox, and then you can download like my side of the audio. Maybe
Great.
it will help.
Usually the Google Hangouts does a really good job of it, and that's why I like
Mm,
doing this instead of Skype, because it
mm.
records on both sides, so it's much easier to just edit one audio file, and then I'll plug in the audio from your end and my end.
Okay.
I posted in the business chat that fascism equals pineapple pizza, and Sonny replies, fascism promises that life will be sweet, but then it's actually salty. Also that the chemical in pineapple will literally eat you from the inside out.
Oh, that's great. But
Technology.
I like the pineapple pizza comparison. Like,
Any podcast that trashes pineapple pizza is a good podcast.
Alrighty. Let's see.
Right.
New age podcast fascism. And then
Yep. All right. I'm gonna do the editing probably sometime this week. It should be up around next Friday, probably in the late afternoon.
okay.
Yep. So I'll be up next Friday, and I'll make like an AMA post essentially. I make that, and then put it up on Twitter and Facebook and wherever you get your needs, I guess.
vertexoflife@gmail.com. So should get the notification that you can
Just got it.
join.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, and I look forward to hearing it. I hope I didn't do too many ums and uhs.
Everybody does and doesn't realize, but it's not that hard to like edit out. Once you get into the flow of like editing, it's just like delete, delete,
Mm,
delete, and then you're fine.
mm.
There are some people who are like especially bad, but you're definitely not one of them. You're more coherent than some English speakers when it comes to English.
Well, I try. Well, I hope you have a good day today.
Thank you. I'm going up north. I'm going to go camping in the woods up in the White
Oh,
Mountains.
nice.
Fortunately, it's
Nice.
stormy out, but we're going to bring my little cousin to a water park because she's never been to one.
Cool.
All right. Well, you have a good day. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, and you
Enjoy
enjoy.
your- It's well deserved.
See ya.
Adios, Joe.